Today it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome to the Fellowship of Sheedy Award winners Peter Holland, the McMeel Family Professor of Shakespeare Studies. No one's more entitled to this recognition than Peter, and no one's recognition will bring more joy to his friends, colleagues, and students. We gather here to celebrate Professor Holland's teaching, and I shall make my devout contribution in a moment, but first I want to round out the picture. Peter Holland went up to Cambridge in 1969 and remained there until 1997, serving finally as Judith Wilson Reader in drama and theater. From 1997 to 2002, Peter was director of the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-upon-Avon, and at the same time, professor of Shakespeare Studies in the University of Birmingham. To our great good fortune, he joined us in 2002, and in 2003 became chair of FTT, a position he held until 2008, when he became Associate Dean for the Arts in the College of Arts and Letters. In 2007-08, as if all this weren't enough, he served as acting dean of the graduate school. Peter Holland is the author or editor of almost 20 books, 7 of them having appeared during his tenure at Notre Dame. Along with his book-length contributions, he's published more than 100 articles, essays, and chapters. He holds and has held leadership positions in countless professional and scholarly associations. When I received my award last year, I said that I believe that teaching is one nested component in a set of professional responsibilities that necessarily involve also scholarship and service. Being true to my own self, I want to stress how neatly Peter Holland's teaching fits within his long, varied, and distinguished record of service and scholarship. The bare details I just recounted, and the teaching record I shall shortly review should suffice to demonstrate that teaching, service, and scholarship are by no means mutually exclusive. Indeed, I firmly believe that the better one is in one of these areas, the greater the likelihood will be that one is accomplished in the others as well. Those who serve an institution know its culture and its people. No one can truly teach who has nothing substantial to profess. Peter Holland's broad accomplishments stand as eloquent testimony to the best that an academic citizen can aspire to be. Shakespeare might have been thinking of Peter when he wrote about mastering a double spirit of teaching and of learning. Of course, it must be said that Peter Holland has some built-in advantages. First of all, don't you think that his stature as a distinguished professor of Shakespeare Studies is enhanced by the fact that he looks like the bard? And then there is that accent, which his students say, rocks. And surely his easy rapport with students is bolstered by his utter devotion to Notre Dame football and his knowledge of such 17th century sports as shin kicking, something in which we academics may actually be more accomplished than we know. Finally, we must all fall in line behind someone who routinely completes the killer Sudoku in the Sunday Guardian in under 5 minutes. Now, I could impress you with the astronomical numbers that appear term after term on Peter's course evaluations, but numbers are bloodless, and they capture half-truths. Words, as our honoree, a close student of our language's premier wordsmith, knows better than anyone else, speak more and better truths. It is, believe me, a moving experience to read the words Peter Holland's students have spoken about him. Certain themes recur in the student comments that I had an opportunity to read. Without exception, students are dazzled by Peter's command of his subject. Now that's impressive, but a glance at Peter's CV would be enough to establish his scholarly bona fides. Students are unanimous in stressing Peter's passion to share what he knows, to help them to learn, and to learn from them. His energy in the classroom and sheer joy in sharing Shakespeare are warmly applauded. Again and again, students talk about Peter's interest in and encouragement of their work. One student remarked, "He encourages you to think for yourself and to expand any idea that you have, no matter how insignificant you think it is. He never thinks it's insignificant." Peter pushes his students to do better, but he does so without intimidating them. One refrain in his testimonials is that he gets students to do more and better than they believed they could. It is a rare and precious gift to elicit more from students than they know that they have to give. Several students called Peter the best teacher they have encountered at Notre Dame. I take it as important that they did not say favorite. I believe that student assessments of Peter Holland are more discerning than that. Several students called Peter inspiring. Concretely, and as but two examples, he inspired one to write a senior thesis and another to pursue graduate studies. Students find him approachable, understanding, and sympathetic. They not only admire him, they like him. A colleague who has taught with Peter captures something intriguing when he speaks of the affected nonchalance with which Peter almost imperceptibly creates an extraordinary structure in his classroom. How does he do this? He does it not by starting out where he is, but instead by listening to find out where the students are. He then goes to meet them and takes them places they never dreamed of. I asked a number of people to share their impressions of Peter Holland. The same terms of reference came up again and again. Kind, thoughtful, articulate, generous, supportive. Several people said Peter is poised, elegant, graceful. Accordingly, I made some discreet inquiries to find out if Peter Holland had himself ever acted. I learned that he had not, that he is unlikely to take direction. I will let John McGreevy be the judge of that. Be that as it may, one sentiment that runs through Peter Holland's Sheedy nomination file is his warmth, collegiality, congeniality. Students and colleagues alike remark on this aspect of Peter's character and personality. No one who knows Peter would ever doubt it. And on that note, I present the 2012 Sheedy Award winner in the College of Arts and Letters, Professor Peter Holland.
Thank you, Tom. I swear there were moments when I almost thought I recognized myself in your description. And I should mention that this notion that I looked like Shakespeare was carried to an extreme by a student who took a photograph of me and morphed my face into the Stratford monument to Shakespeare, and you can't see the join. Thinking of the Sheedy Award as the equivalent of a Notre Dame teaching Oscar, obviously I ought to start by saying I'd like to thank the Academy. But actually I want to start by thanking John and Susan McMeel, who with such generosity endowed the chair that brought me here to Notre Dame in 2002. Now, something is plainly wrong with giving me the Sheedy Award, and I kept asking Joanne Delaneva when she told me the news, was she really sure she had the right person, or would she turn out to have made a very, very embarrassing mistake? This is my 11th year at Notre Dame, and only in my first year did I actually teach a full 2-2 load. I don't think the committee really had enough evidence to make their decision, but it's too late now. And nothing, but nothing in my teaching career has made me feel quite so proud. Ironically, in order to be here now, I've had to cancel class today. Not that my students complain too much about that. So, to my matter. Consider these brief synopses of 7 film adaptations of Romeo and Juliet. The quiz questions will follow in a moment, and as my students know to their cost and their annoyance, I like tough quizzes. 1. Romeo and Juliet are kept apart by the politics of their two families in late 20th century America, middle-class Republicans and blue-collar Democrats. 2. Romeo and Julianne are lawyers working for rival firms, kept apart by the ethical differences between their approaches to the practice of the law and to corporate greed as they confront each other in a major case of corporate fraud. 3. Romeo and Juliet belong to families of feuding gnomes in the gardens of adjacent houses numbered 2B and not 2B. 4. Romeo and Julian are high school basketball players who discover their sexual orientation and mutual attraction and have to cope with the opposition of family and friends. 5. The young lovers are the children of warring fast food franchises who come together because they both love Shakespeare and are involved in a school production of Romeo and Juliet. 6. The lovers are not teenagers at all, but seniors in a retirement home. 7. The Romeo and Juliet story is mapped onto the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. Now, question 1, an easy one. Identify which of these 7 is an animated film released in 2011. Question 2, difficult. Identify which one is set in and made in Singapore and released in 2000. Question 3, next to impossible. How could you get hold of a copy of any of the other 5? Now, the answer to question 1 is, as I'm sure many of you know, film 3, The Feuding Gnomes of Gnomeo and Juliet, with a soundtrack of numbers by Elton John and the voices of, among others, Maggie Smith, Michael Caine, Dolly Parton, Ozzy Osbourne, and Hulk Hogan. No, I'm not making this up. It can stand here for the pervasive cultural presence of the Romeo narrative and the playfulness of playing with and playing off Shakespeare, the profoundly resonant echoing of the story as something we know without knowing quite how we know it. My students love the movie, as do I, and my one rule in class discussion of it is that each student may only use the word cute once. The Singaporean film is number 5, Chicken Rice War, in which the fast food franchises are run by rival families, is a Shakespeare film adaptation which, like many others, embeds high school Shakespeare into itself. It locates the cultural experience of Shakespeare in pre-college education, but, as in 10 Things I Hate About You, allowing for the idea that school kids might actually rather like Shakespeare. But it also stands here for the global Shakespeare film, legacies of empire in this case, but mapped onto a non-Anglophone text within which Shakespeare's own text exists. And question 3, where can you find the other 5, is a trick question because all the other 5 are outlines of screenplays created by Notre Dame students as part of their midterm papers in my Shakespeare and film class this semester. I'd never tried asking my class to create their own Shakespeare films before, but I stole the idea from a friend in England, imitation being, of course, the sincerest form of flattery, and as an early modernist, I value the art of imitatio. So I made their first substantial piece of writing, the first 5 pages of a Shakespeare screenplay, and coupled it with a 5-page analysis that they had to write of what they had written, its curve, its filmic style, its intended audience demographic, its cultural contexts, its purpose. I had more fun reading these midterms than any others I've ever had, and I fondly imagine the students seem to have had more fun writing them. Fun is a crucial term in, well, the word had to turn up sooner or later, in my pedagogy, which is a concept I can honestly say I had never thought about before coming to Notre Dame. Now, some of you will have noticed by now that none of this seems to involve much work on the Shakespeare plays underpinning these films, completed or imagined. Teaching Shakespeare and, as I usually do, Shakespeare and film, Shakespeare and performance, Shakespeare and editing, for instance, is not the same as teaching some version of Shakespeare tout court, something I've actually not yet done at Notre Dame. One of the series I'm involved in as a general editor is called Oxford Shakespeare Topics. It's an Oxford University Press series, which I run with Stanley Wells, and currently stretches, and stretches is the right word, to 22 volumes, nearly all with titles in the form Shakespeare and text, and masculinity, and the drama of his time, and material culture, and the Bible, and so on, leavened with a few Shakespeare ins, in America, in Eastern Europe, in the 18th century. It seems to be the way my mind works, and it's the way my discipline thinks, but it involves a complex interrogation of that and As I try to make plain in my course on Shakespeare and film, the and in the middle is a really complex dynamic, not a simple linkage. How one might get from one side of the and to the other is the crucial question, and in either direction. Now, the kinds of questions I'm asking of the materials with which I work and which I teach depend on one of the central features of working on Shakespeare, who is, of course, the gift that keeps on giving, or in the phrase used by Judi Dench and her late husband Michael Williams, the gentleman who pays the rent. If quiz questions tend to have only right answers and wrong answers, questions about meaning in Shakespeare, and indeed questions about Shakespeare films or Shakespeare performances, depend not on either or, but both and, a mode of thinking that underpins the openness of the object and which reinserts the subject into the negotiation with the text. And my students can be unnerved by the discovery that in papers for my class, they are not only permitted, but also encouraged to write the word I. Writing about Shakespeare cannot be done well within a template constructed for high school students, most of whom, by definition, are less talented than students at Notre Dame. Writing about Shakespeare cannot be done well if done dispassionately, as an academic exercise, as nothing more than a course requirement. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we teach, we're taught. And I can't honestly say that I was well taught in English studies. It's time for a bit of autobiography. I was the first in my family to go to college. Since many Americans tend to assume that being part of an immigrant culture is their prerogative, let me just say that I'm first-generation British on one side and second-generation on the other. My mother's parents were Jews from Russia who met and married in London. My father was an illegal immigrant who, with 3 friends, all in their mid-teens, fled from their Polish shtetl in 1927. Theatre was the art form that my parents loved, and I work now on Shakespeare and performance because of the delight, the profound delight, in going to the theatre that I shared with them. There is a thrill in being at a live performance, in that moment as the house lights go down, that is one of the great and repeated joys of my life. But nothing in my experience of Shakespeare at school had anything to do with performance. What I enjoyed doing at and for school was reading, all day and every day if I could, and reading anything and everything. I borrowed books from the wonderful public libraries in my suburbs. Actually, I belonged to libraries in 2 different boroughs of London so that I could borrow more books at a time. And my parents encouraged me in that love of books. Learning has always had a high status in Jewish communities, but especially in North London, even if Jews were not yet always welcomed in the best schools. My own public school, i.e. private school, had only recently abolished its 3% quota of Jewish schoolboys when I went there in the late 1950s. When I went up to university, my father, bless him, gave me an allowance, but also opened accounts in his name at the 2 major bookshops in Cambridge, so that buying books was never something I had to choose over the important purchases of student life, like buying beer. I loved books then, and I still do, in that slightly manic way that results in the chaos of books in my office and study. So I went up to Cambridge to read English. In England, you read a subject, you don't major in it, and the different formulation may be significant. And read English is what I did. No university requirements, no maths or theo, or phys ed, or writing and rhetoric, just 3 years of English. Oh, and 3 years of discovering film in the vibrant student film culture of Cambridge, and 3 years of watching student theatre too, where I quickly learned that I couldn't direct and had no desire to act. Now, teaching in Cambridge takes 2 forms. Tutorials, known as supervisions, 1-hour sessions once a week, in pairs with a faculty member, for which one wrote papers every single week. I had one supervisee who wrote 30 pages a week for me, 30 exciting, thoughtful, smart pages at that. And then there were lectures, entirely optional, on which we voted with our feet, coming back each week or not, as we chose. And the lectures were wonderful. Brilliant people, usually reading their carefully written lecture, and we learned to listen attentively for an hour, wanting to hear, say, Raymond Williams, the founding father of cultural studies, who lectured without a script, sat on a stool, and talked in an arc that precisely shaped his argument and equally precisely filled the hour, while at the back of the room was sat his wife Joy, taking notes so that he could write his next book from her notes. Such is devotion. But the supervisions I had were poor until my last undergraduate year, when Brian Vickers took pity on me and gave me a few supervisions on the history and theory of literary criticism, and he enabled me to understand what being an academic is all about. Brian's passion for teaching meant that he would bicycle round to my flat on a Sunday morning with lists of yet more articles to be read for the next supervision. I didn't do that for my students in Cambridge, and I haven't done that here. But I try to convey that passion that I feel just as much as Brian does. And then, after a couple of years of graduate work, I started giving supervisions, proposing lecture courses to the department, being a teacher. And no one ever told me how to do it. There was no training, no resources, no CNEB, no discussion of pedagogy. I taught, we all taught, as best as we could, and we taught a lot. Until I reached the Cambridge equivalent of full professor, when university regulations limited me to no more than 6 hours of supervisions a week, I gave a minimum of a dozen supervisions a week, plus the lectures I taught for the department. In my heaviest teaching week ever in the run-up to exams, and all grades depended 100% on final exams set by the department's exam board, not by the course instructor, in 1 week I once gave 35 supervisions, 7 hours a day for 5 days, smoking non-stop to calm myself. You could then. Supervisions can have an intensity, and given how good the students can be, a sharpness of engagement that is unequaled. But I still had no pedagogy. Moving to Notre Dame was therefore something of a shock. I'd never written a course outline, except for a course at UCLA when I visited there for a quarter. I'd never taught a 15-week semester. I'd never prescribed midterms and finals and journal entries and response pieces. I'd never taught a class of 20. If some of our new junior faculty struggled in their first semesters, so did this senior faculty member. I had 2 advantages. One, Tom has referred to, my voice. None of you, I suspect, will get that narrative TCE he mentioned, which ignored the standard questions and simply read, "His accent really rocks." I can't help it. It's not an accent. It's what I sound like. And all the years in Cambridge of lecturing and supervising and talking at dinner trained me in speaking in complex sentences as eloquently as possible. And I came to understand that here, eloquence is not necessarily a word of praise. Rather, it connotes here a suspicion that this is superficial rhetoric, not thought. In Cambridge, there's a distinction between being intelligent and being clever, with the latter viewed with the same dubiety as eloquence can be here. But we learn to speak well, to use the skills of rhetoric to make our speech persuasive, not as a disguise to cover poor thought or to erase weaknesses. Eloquence, for me, is a means of conveying the truth. The other advantage I have is that I have a great teaching mentor. Everything I know about teaching at Notre Dame comes from watching Romana teach and watching her engage with her students. We're different kinds of teachers, of course, and she doesn't have an English accent. But as I've watched her prep for class or comment on student papers, met her at a day's end after her innumerable long talks with her students, listened to her worrying about a course's design or the demands on student time, I've learned how I might try to teach as well as she does. as a student that we share said to me on Monday, "She's awesome." She is. This award is hers as much as mine. Since 2004, I've had a third advantage, teaching my film classes in the Browning Cinema. Now, as someone who used to screen films for class by renting reels of 16mm, using a noisy projector onto a lousy screen, I know, but my students don't know, just how lucky they are to be studying and enjoying films, even from DVDs, projected in our very own THX certified cinema. Digital projection is the next and vitally necessary step for our work. Before long, no new film will be available on celluloid. Development, please take note. Still, one can't always hope to please everyone in a class. I looked myself up the other week on ratemyprofessors.com. There are only 2 comments. The first, from 2006, reads, "Looks just like Shakespeare, including the bad hair, and has great accent. What more do you want in a hot Shakespeare expert?" And I'm reminded that for a long time, the Notre Dame directory listed me as Professor, Shakespeare stud. The second comment, from 2010, just says, "He makes me angry." And it follows it with 16 exclamation marks. I counted them. And that saddens me. Not that I angered the student, I can cope with that, but that she or he never talked to me about it. That's truly disappointing. There are 2 more things I want to talk about, very briefly. The first, since this is a public platform and I have your attention, is to say that I really and truly believe it is time for Notre Dame to reconsider its university requirements and core curriculum. It's closing on 40 years since they were established in their current form, and the world, as you will have noticed, has changed. It's not the announced aims of the core curriculum that is at fault, but it is a real question whether our requirements still fulfill those aims. As I mentioned, my own intellectual formation did not involve any Gen Ed, and I'm not convinced that what we work with here, the high number of requirements, 14 or 15 in all, more than we require in a major, and their distribution, really serves our 21st century students well. My students do not bring their math and science courses to bear on their work with me, nor even their Theo and Philo courses. The liberal arts education that we pride ourselves on is, for most, simply a matter of ticking boxes, not of creating a coherent educational experience. It's time to consider the matter afresh. Now, I know that the members of any working party on the topic would be committing themselves to a vast labour, much antagonism, and likely failure. But the lack of training in so much that underpins our graduates' experience of our world seems to me the worst kind of fossilization. We need, I think, requirements in technology and visual literacy, not calculus. It's time to take on the task. That's the serious business. The other is that I promised myself I'd show just one clip. Something I find rich and complex and provoking. Something that's funny and potent and contemporary. Something that speaks of film cultures and studio systems and where Shakespeare might be found in them. Something that shows the endless meta-status of Shakespeare film, constructing always a commentary on itself. Something that rethinks an attitude towards Shakespeare's language and how we might now understand it. Something that enjoys its own in-jokes and knows that few in the audience will get all of them. Something that relates to film genres my students know far more about than I do, for I always learn from them and with them. Something that is the kind of material that I love using in class because it makes me smile, and it's fun, and it's pleasurable for me, and central to my teaching is a clear belief that if I'm not enjoying the materials, there is precious little chance that my students will. Well, no one clip could do all of that, but here is the nearest I could come up with. It's from John McTiernan's 1993 film, Last Action Hero. Danny Madigan is a school kid whose screen hero is Jack Slater, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. At one point, Danny is on his way to school, hours late, having been watching the latest Jack Slater film for the 6th time in the rundown, near-derelict local movie theatre where the projectionist is his friend. And I should mention that one joke in this sequence depends on the fact that Danny's school teacher in this sequence is played by Joan Plowright, who is the widow of Laurence Olivier. And with luck, it should play.
That's good. And in the end, everybody dies. Shakespeare's Hamlet couldn't be more exciting. Now, though it may seem that he is incapable of taking any action, he is, in fact, one of the first action heroes. What you are going to see is a scene from the film by Laurence Olivier. Some of you might have seen him in the Polaroid commercial, or as Zeus in Clash of the Titans.
Oh, bosom, thanks. Only get the world.
There you go.
You killed my father. Big mistake. Something wrong in the state of Denmark. And Hamlet is taking out the trash. See thy hand, fair prince. Who said I'm fair? No one's going to tell this sweet prince good night. To be or not to be? Not to be.
Wasn't that fun? Thank you.